Michael, how's it going today?
Okay, how are you?
I am excellent. Is this still a good time to ask you a few questions?
Yeah, I'm actually on a train right now. I got called into a set visit in the city at the last minute, so I hope that's okay. I mean, if you don't mind a little background noise on it, you might hear train noises every so often. This is fine with me.
Sure, yeah, it gives you kind of maybe like a chud sort of ambiance, so it works.
You can say I'm deep in the sewers under New York.
All right, well, Michael, if you could tell us first a bit about your new book, Ad Nauseam, Newsprint Nightmares from the 1980s. Definitely a cool book. I just finished it yesterday. But can you tell the listeners a bit about it?
Well, it's something that I've wanted to do for close to 20 years, I guess, because when I was a kid, also in the 1980s, I was collecting horror movie newspaper ads. It was something that was easy to collect. It didn't cost anything, and it was kind of a way to have mementos of a lot of films that for a little while I couldn't even go to see because I was just too young. And so, I just started in 1979, actually, and I just kept going from there, and I collected them all the way through a few years ago when newspaper advertising for movies basically became a thing of the past. And I'd always thought it would be cool to kind of put all these ads together in one book, and the title Ad Nauseam occurred to me almost immediately. And then in early 2017, I guess, Dave Alexander for Rue Morgue said he'd made a deal with Matt Fangoria at 1984 Publishing to do some books that were kind of art-oriented, and asked if I had any ideas. And I told them about Ad Nauseam, and they all sparked to it, and here we are. The book's been doing really well. I'm really gratified by the response to it so far.
Yeah, that is awesome. What was it that made you want to collect all these clips? I doubt you had the foresight to think you're probably going to have a book out sometime down the road, but was it just the artwork?
Oh, certainly not. Yeah, well, I mean, the artwork for the ads back then was really attention-grabbing and lurid, and, this was back in the day when, video was really in its infancy. I mean, home video hadn't really exploded yet, and so, they really needed to get those people into the theaters, and so they made the ads as extreme and lurid and crazy as they could, and, as a kid, seeing these ads and not being able to see the films, this was pretty much the only experience I had of them. So I just kind of collected them as mementos. The short answer I've been using is it was cheaper than collecting posters. And I guess I was a little bit obsessive as a fan even back then. And so I just got the paper every Friday. And, I discovered, as I mentioned in the intro, that the tabloids like the Daily News and the New York Post would have ads that the New York Times would not. And so I would check the Times and the Post and the News every Friday and just see where the good ads were and cut them out.
Well, obviously, there were horror films, before and after the 1980s, but, that decade really seemed to include all the best and the worst and the weirdest ones, I think.
Yeah, well, this was right after Halloween in 1978 and into 79. That movie was such a huge hit that, suddenly everyone wanted to make slasher movies. And then in 1979, you had Alien and a whole bunch of other major studio horror films, some of which were big successes. And it just kind of jump-started this whole trend, and you had a lot of great movies, and, a lot of really bad ones, too. But, sometimes the worst movies had the best ads. So that's kind of the fun thing, is to go through and see a lot of these ads that actually promised a lot more than the movies delivered.
Yeah, that seemed to be a lot of false advertising, I guess you could say. I was a kid in the 80s, but I didn't see any of these in the theater, but my love for them came in the 90s, when you'd be scanning all the VHS covers at the video store. And it was a lot of times the cover was the best part of the whole thing.
Yeah, and in many cases, the video companies would try to make the cover art different from the newspaper ads. And that's what's kind of cool, is some of this art you could only see as a newspaper ad. You can't find it as either a video cover or a poster. So a lot of the stuff is really kind of unique that way.
Well, can you describe, Michael, I guess, what it was like seeing some of these films in the theater? I mean, that experience and the excitement of seeing it with an audience. It seems like it was a lot different then than it would be now.
I discovered in 1981, I guess, that I could actually go to see R-rated horror films without having a parent or adult guardian with me. The first R-rated horror film I ever saw in a theater without a parent was Halloween 2 in 1981. I was 14 years old. And at that point, the floodgates just kind of opened, and I started going to see these things as often as I could. And I started going into New York City to see them after a certain point, and that was always fun. I actually made my first trip to one of the grindhouses on 42nd Street when I was 16 with a friend of mine, and we were kind of naive and didn't really know what we were getting into. But it's always more fun seeing these movies with a good, responsive audience. I mean, that audience at Halloween 2 was just yelling and screaming and yelling at Jamie Lee Curtis to get out of that room. And it's still so much more fun to see it in a theater than it is to watch it at home on video.
Awesome. Again, Michael Gingold with us, and we're talking about his new book, Ad Nauseam, Newsprint Nightmares from the 1980s. And the one thing I love about the book, Michael, you included a lot of the reviews from the critics over the years. And, of course, a lot of these films kind of meant to be, tongue-in-cheek, but it seems like a lot of these critics weren't in on the joke and really just seemed offended by everything.
Well, this was back at the time when, the slasher films at the time are kind of looked on positively now, but back then they were looked at, some of them, like Friday the 13th, were looked at as one step away from being pornography. And unfortunately, the whole horror genre got kind of lumped in with them by some critics, even though there was a great variety of stuff coming out. So a lot of these films didn't get the critical respect they deserved. The classic example is John Carpenter's The Thing, which was slammed viciously by a lot of critics at the time and is now considered a classic. But one of the things that surprised me while I was putting all these reviews together was certain films got more positive reviews than you'd expect. Terror Train, of all movies, which is one of the slasher films, got a lot of positive reviews back at the time. So one of the things that me and the editors wanted to do was kind of, vary it between, movies that got the respect they deserve, movies that got unfairly slammed, and then some films that were kind of surprisingly well-liked by critics back then. So we really tried to get a variety of that kind into the selections in the book.
And it's great to see, how things have changed as far as, like films would come out and then they would be redistributed with different artwork and different names and just different everything over the years. But if you had to choose, could you pick maybe a favorite advertisement from the book or one that you always had a soft spot for?
Oh, there's so many of them, but I will say my favorite tagline in there is in the ad for a re-release of The Blob and Son of the Blob. In 1981, I think it was. They brought out the original Steve McQueen one, and then the sequel, which was directed by Larry Hagman, and they re-released it right around the time Dallas Mania, the TV show, and there's the big question of who shot J.R., and so the ad said, since Larry Hagman played J.R., they called Son of Blob the movie J.R. shot, which is always one of my favorite taglines. And amongst the others, there's so many. People ask me that question, and I really honestly can't point to one that I just look at and say it's my favorite out of all the others. I just love the variety of all the stuff that came out over that decade.
Yeah, definitely. I think I liked the one, I think it was Night of the Living Dead. I don't remember, but it was paired with a Three Stooges film, and it said violence of a different kind for the second feature.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, the two different kinds of violence, Night of the Living Dead and the Three Stooges. That's another thing that was great about the 80s was before video had really exploded, you had things like Night of the Living Dead and the Three Stooges would play midnight shows, and there's a few others in there where they would have older films playing midnights, and they would actually advertise them in the newspapers.
Well, I know you were busy over the years here, a longtime editor with Fangoria magazine, and I read that you're back with them now, and you're also working with Rue Morgue, so it sounds like you've really had a hand in things here for the better part of 30 years or more.
Yeah, I got lucky. I started writing for Fangoria in college, and then a year after I graduated, I joined the staff, and I was with them through all the ups and downs. I joined the mag full-time in 1990, and that's when horror kind of went into a downslide for several years, and then at the end of the decade, Scream and Blair Witch Project and Sixth Sense brought it back. So, it's been great to just be able to cover the genre for so long and to have my hand in so many different projects. We just had a signing event for the second issue of the new Fangoria, and we had a crowd there for the entire time. The line never let up. So it's really great that people are still responding to the magazine in print.
Yeah, that was such an important magazine for so many people over the years, and then just with the genre, I guess it kind of faded out. But it sounds like maybe all it needed was just a little break, and now it sounds like it's back and better than ever.
Well, the magazine kind of ended its first incarnation just because of its mismanagement. So that's all I can say about that. But, it's just a matter of getting the right people behind it and people who really believed in it and had the wherewithal to bring it back to its former glory. And I think that's what the current owners and publishers have done with Fango. It's really great seeing all the different voices that they brought in for the new edition.
Well, Michael, this is an odd question, but I'm a longtime Troma fan. So I got to ask you how you found yourself part of the Toxic Avenger films and a citizen of Tromaville.
Well, Troma, after a while, I guess, decided to move out of their pastures in New Jersey, and moved into suburban New York, and that's where I wound up actually. I was an extra in Troma's More, and then in Toxic Avenger 2 and 3. And then when I started going to school in New York City in 1985, I discovered that Troma would have critic screenings for everything they released, right down to the smallest, sleaziest film. And I don't know for sure, but I think part of the reason is that, that way they could get reviews in all the papers, and it was cheaper to do that than to take out advertising. So even if the review was negative, it would bring attention to the film. So I would go to advanced screenings of pretty much everything Troma put out. I remember seeing the first Toxic Avenger in a screening room with about half the cast sitting around me. And, they were really, fun and outrageous, and they were doing all these crazy films. And it was really fun to kind of be in New York City at the time when Troma was at its peak.
Yeah, we've had Lloyd Kaufman on the show before, and that guy is really, if you want to point to somebody who's kind of championing the horror genre and just independent cinema in general, that's really the guy, I think.
Yeah, it was funny because his quote about making the Toxic Avenger was, he said he read in Variety that horror films were on their way out, and he said that, well, the mainstream is usually wrong, or Hollywood is usually wrong, so that's when he decided to get into horror and do Toxic Avenger and the other horror films that they released.
Well, again, Ad Nauseum, Newsprint Nightmares from the 1980s is out now, and is there something else maybe you're working on, or maybe another book might be coming up down the road?
You might see a follow-up to that book. We're still talking about it, but I'm hoping, I still have lots of other ads in the collection, so I'm hoping I'll be able to bring more of the collection to people later this year, so keep your eyes open for that.
Awesome. Yeah, I would love to speak with you again if and when that happens.
Sure, and I'm also continuing to contribute to the new Fangoria and Rue Morgue magazine, and I write for Birth Movies Death Online, and I've been working with a few Blu-ray companies, doing featurettes and liner notes, so I'm keeping my hands on a lot of different projects all over the horror field.
Awesome. Again, the book is amazing, and I really hope we see a sequel to it. I'm looking forward to that. Thank you so much for your time, Michael.
Thank you. I appreciate the promotion for the book.
All right, you bet. Have a good one.
All right, you too. Take care.
Bye-bye.